Assalamu alaikum. Sorry, one more time. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, now we're past the technical difficulties, we can start. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-mursaleen, wa ala alihi al-tayyibin al-tahirin, wa ala sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. First of all, let me say it's nice to be able to address you without having to make announcements, halqas or khutbahs or fundraising. So finally I get to address you in a different aspect. Basically, this is a summary of a presentation that I've given in many other masajid and many other forums. And this is kind of a shorter version of it. As you all know, this is a very vast and wide subject. And so this is basically just a very brief introductory and cursory introduction to the topic. I want to actually start the presentation by recalling some very interesting research that I came across many years ago. And you'll see why it's relevant in this particular case. A few years ago, I came across some research from a doctor named Paul Pearsall. He's written a book called The Heart Code. He's based in California. And as many of you know, heart transplant surgery has been occurring for many, many years now. And so what he did was he basically went back and he did some follow-up work with some of the heart transplant recipients, just to follow up with them and see how they were doing years after the fact. So in this particular case, he and his colleagues found, some very interesting findings. And basically what they were finding was that the recipients were taking on various qualities of the donor, and in some cases in very strange ways. For example, some of the recipients started to like some of the foods that the donor liked. Some of them started to use language and verbiage that the other person used to use considerably. Some of them started to like similar types of music that the other person liked. And the only way this could be verified was through these intermediaries. Because as many of you know, the US laws are such that when somebody donates an organ, it's anonymous and they don't tell the recipient who's giving what. So these people, Dr. Paul Pearsall and others, were like intermediaries who came and did this follow-up work. And they started finding these bizarre findings. And to give you their most extreme example was in the case of a lady who had been murdered. She had been murdered viciously, and she had indicated that she was going to be a heart donor. So they took the heart of this particular woman and transplanted it into somebody else. And interestingly enough, soon after that, she started seeing very strange dreams. And in these dreams, she was basically seeing nightmares that related to a murder scene. And they describe this in their book, so it's a very amazing story when you think about it. But basically, because these people were intermediaries, they realized something was wrong, because they knew that this donor was a woman who had been murdered. So they actually informed the police, and the police actually followed up with this particular woman. And it actually helped them to actually solve the crime and apprehend the murderer. So this is really a stunning and kind of amazing example of something that we have very little understanding about. You may be wondering, why am I opening this presentation with this? There are a few reasons. Number one, we know that in Islam, the role of the heart is much more than a physical organ or just a pump. It's much more than that. It relates to your spiritual health. But even more importantly than that, I wanted to point out that the subject of modern science still has a long way to go. They often brag in the media about how much science knows, but the fact is there's much more that we don't know. Allah has made a very miraculous body on both a physical level, as well as emotional level, as well as spiritual levels. And so we have still a long way to go when it comes to understanding these things. The third reason why I bring it up, I've been giving presentations, alhamdulillah, on this subject for many years. And when I talk to Muslims about this particular subject, I usually get one of a few reactions. Most people, alhamdulillah, are very supportive, and they realize the wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ pertains to many different subjects. Some people, when you talk to them about this subject, they say, well, you know, these things that the Prophet ﷺ recommended, these were things from another time. We have modern medicine now. We don't really need all these old, you know, recommendations that are more than 1,400 years old. Unfortunately, you have this attitude out there as well. Some people also come with another attitude, and they'll say that, well, you know, the Prophet ﷺ, he's given us recommendations about ibadat, he's given us recommendations about behavior and akhlaq. But when it comes to food and science and these kinds of things, medicine, we don't really need any of that. So, almost lost it. So anyway, this is the reason I brought this particular subject up. And with that, I'll go ahead and start the actual presentation. First of all, we need to define at the outset what is meant by certain terms. When we talk about Tibb al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it basically relates to the sayings and actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that relate to health and disease. Some people have a misconception that the medicine of the Prophet ﷺ is a completely comprehensive system where there's a miraculous cure for every single disease. That if there's disease X, Y, Z, there's a specific formula from the Prophet ﷺ. It's not like that. But definitely the Prophet ﷺ has given us many recommendations, guidelines. Our religion itself has given us so many guidelines from which to draw on that relate to health and healing. So some people use a broader term, which is Islamic medicine, and that relates to the system of healing based on Islamic principles. Some people, especially from the Indo-Pak subcontinent, use the term that we know as Unani Tibb. This is a term used to this day in India and Pakistan. By an ironic twist or fate of history, you know, as all the Arab brothers know here, Unani is Greek, and this was basically based on the ancient form of Greek medicine. Ironically, in modern day Greece, you know, they do not practice that at all right now. But ironically, in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, they practice certain elements of that. The reason it was still called Unani Tibb over these last few centuries is many of the early Muslim physicians had adopted various principles from the ancient Greek medicine and Islamized it, if I could use that term. You all are familiar with many of the famous physicians like Razis and Ibn Sina and so forth. So that is the term they use to refer to that. There are a few underlying principles that I need to go over before we get into some more practical benefits from the Prophet ﷺ. And this relates to kind of the overall Islamic view of health and healing. The first and most important principle is that healing is from Allah. You know, earlier in the khutbah, the Imam was speaking about إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينَ, and that whenever we fall into trouble, we have to rely on Allah alone, because He is the source of all healing. So interestingly enough, like the dua of Ibrahim a.s., وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِ. I was once listening to a scholar who was speaking about this ayah, and he said an interesting thing, which I hadn't thought of. And he says, why didn't Allah say, you know, when Allah makes you sick, He heals you? In fact, he says, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِ. And his point was that in general, it's usually things we do or things we fail to do that make us sick, and then Allah heals us. Similarly, we know in a famous hadith that مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ مِن دَاءٍ إِلَّا أَنزَلَ لَهُ شِفَاءً, or كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم, that Allah has not sent down any disease except that He has also sent its cure. So it clearly implies then that it is up to us to go out and search for these cures within the beautiful world that He has created. Another implication of this is, you know, that doctors or medicines, we're not gods. Right? Some people in the society have this view that it is doctors who heal or miraculous medicines that heal. No, it's definitely not the case. It is Allah who heals. Similarly, Allah doesn't just heal Muslims, He heals everyone. He heals non-Muslims, He heals atheists, He heals agnostics, He heals Hindus, He heals everyone. And that is because all healing is from Allah and from Him alone. So some of you may remember years ago there was what they call the Doctor of Death, Dr. Jack Kevorkian. He used to go around various hospitals, and they used to, you remember, how many of you remember Dr. Kevorkian? Oh yeah, we do. So you know, I mean, this is an example of how people in this society take death in their own hands. he's literally going around and pulling the plug on people, right? Basically enforcing death. And obviously, I mean, that's another whole subject in Islam, but that's something that would not generally be permissible. Another key principle is that health is not just about physical health, but it is holistic, meaning it is about emotional health, it is also about spiritual health, and they are all intertwined and related. As a simple example, you all have heard about what we call panic attacks. You know, sometimes soldiers go fight in various wars, they come back, they have certain emotions, they may recall certain memories. What happens? All of a sudden they get into a sudden attack where they have all kinds of physical symptoms. Their blood pressure raises, their heartbeat raises, they start sweating, some of them think they're choking. This is basically an example of how certain emotions bring on severe physical reactions. Similarly, all of the Muslim physicians have talked about how you can imagine if somebody is in this world and has no clue or no idea about where he or she is going in this world. He has no idea of the purpose of life, and they just roam about this earthly existence. Definitely that will eventually affect their physical and emotional well-being or lack thereof. A very good example of this, I opened the presentation with a discussion of the heart. That's a very long subject, but the only reason I mention it is we know very well in the Quran, for example, it says, فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ فَزَادَهُمُ اللَّهُ مَرَضًا. As a simple example, it refers to the heart in many places, but it's talking about the kuffar and the munafiqeen, that they have a disease in their hearts, and Allah has increased their disease. What is Allah talking about? He's not talking about a physical disease in the heart organ. He's not talking about angina or high blood pressure or some problem with the mitral valve, anything like that. He's talking about a state of a spiritual illness or a spiritual disease. So this is again an example of the link where the heart for us is simultaneously a physical, emotional, as well as a spiritual organ. Another key principle that we need to point out is that health is a blessing and a huge amana or trust from Allah. You know, there's so many books about Tibb al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam from various scholars. There's the famous one from Imam Ibn al-Qayyim. In that book he says something where he says basically that after Iman, the biggest blessing or ni'mah that Allah has given any believer is health. You know, there's a famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says there are two things which people often waste, and that is their free time and their health. So this is an example that, you know, this is something we have to guard and do whatever we can to maintain. On the flip side of that, we have the view in Islam that sickness or illness is a type of ibtila or test or tribulation from Allah. In society, when we look all around us, what do we see? We see the opposite. As soon as people get sick, what do? They say, oh my God, how could God do this to me? Why did this happen? Why me? Right? This is the first thing we hear. In Islam, we don't have that view at all. We think of it as a type of test. Sometimes it can be a source of punishment that may be intended to redirect our actions. Sometimes it can be a source of forgiveness. Sometimes it can be a source of strengthening our own character. It could strengthen our faith. It could be strengthening our immune system. There are many different levels to it. As a simple example, the Prophet ﷺ has had many different hadith about the role of illness and how it is a source of expiation of our sins. There's one particular hadith that gives an example, and it says that when you're sick, your sins are shed off just like the rust is shut off from iron in a hot furnace. Similarly, there's one particular hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says if somebody is sick for 3 consecutive days, their sins are forgiven to the point where they're back like a baby. SubhanAllah, this is amazing. There's even a hadith, famous one, that if you're pricked by a thorn, Allah gives you reward for that. So imagine if you're afflicted by a major disease. So we have a totally different view when it comes to illness. Another key point is that, you know, some of you may have heard of maqasid al-Sharia, that there are overall purposes of Sharia. one of the purposes of Sharia is that it is life affirming. Preservation of life is foremost. That's why scholars give the example that, a hypothetical example, if somebody's in the desert, they have nothing to eat except pork, they go ahead and do it. Why? Because you have to maintain life there. Similarly, what I'm talking about here is that Sharia itself is life affirming and is all about preserving life. So it behooves us as human beings to do whatever we can in order to preserve our health. Sometimes when I talk to Muslims, sometimes people say it jokingly, but they'll say, well, like in Urdu, they'll say, "Marna to aayi," right? We have to die anyway. Let's eat this, eat that. Smoking, all kinds of bad habits that we have, and they have a very lax attitude sometimes when it comes to health. But as I said, if we really study our deen, it is very life affirming and tells us that we have to really do our best to maintain and safeguard our health. Similarly, there were preventive measures, and we'll get into this more later, that the Prophet ﷺ talked about as it pertains to diet, when hygiene, tahara. The concept of tahara in Islam is so vast that no other religion has anything so detailed. As another example, I mentioned quarantine. This was something that they do to this day when there were certain diseases or plagues that afflicted people. The Prophet ﷺ took certain measures to control that, so preventive measures, right? So this is another example of that. This one is a big subject, so I won't talk about this right now. Let me get more into the heart of the presentation too, and that relates to the various methods employed by the Prophet ﷺ when it comes to healing. There are kind of several overall. I broke this down into at least 4 or 5 categories. One of them relates to the recitation of Quran and various du'as, what we call ruqyah. The other aspect relates to the various forms of worship that we engage in. Other aspects relate to our diet, exercise, balanced lifestyle. Other aspects relate to various natural medicines that Allah has created within the planet. Another one that I'll talk about is hijama, or what we call cupping and venesection and so forth. But let me first start with a quick discussion on the Quran itself. We know that the Quran, or Allah tells us Himself that the Quran is a form of healing. That's not according to you or me, it's according to Allah Himself. For example, وَنُنَزِّلُ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ مَا هُوَ شِفَاءٌ وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. We send down of the Quran that which is a healing and mercy to those who believe. As a simple example, many of you may know the story of some of the companions who were going on a journey in the desert, and they stopped at a particular place. There was one person who was bit by a scorpion, and you all know how poisonous that can be. These particular companions were never told by the Prophet ﷺ this, but they went ahead and recited Surah Al-Fatiha over it, and also had the person recite it. And when, of course, the person was healed miraculously, very quickly, and when they went back to the Prophet ﷺ, he affirmed this, and he said, "How did you know to do this?" And they basically said that we know that the Quran is healing, right? So this is a very key point, and sometimes we underappreciate this point. Sometimes as soon as we get sick, we rush to get our medicine, we rush to get our Tylenol, Aleve, our prescriptions, without even thinking sometimes. The other thing is, prayer itself, dua, is very powerful. Earlier in the study, at the presentation, I mentioned some research. There's some very interesting research regarding the power of prayer in healing as well. For example, there are some studies now, and these are what we call double-blind placebo studies that are now published in journals. There was one particular group of several hundreds of women who were in South Korea, who were all infertile. They could not have babies. So in this particular study, they took people here in this country who never even met these women in South Korea and had them start praying for one group of them. It was too bad for, I guess, the group that didn't get prayed for. They had to have a control group. But just by this simple prayer, and this was a multi-denominational group, they were able to achieve a doubling in the rate of pregnancy or fertility just by that. Similarly, there was a study done at Duke University where they took patients who had suffered heart attacks, and they looked at the recovery of these patients. They again took a group that didn't know any of these heart patients and had them start praying for them. They just gave them their names, sometimes their pictures, and said, start praying for these people. Interestingly enough, again, the people who were prayed for, they doubled their rate of recovery. Similarly, they even found that when people in the hospital came just to talk to them, just by talking to them and inquiring how they felt, their recovery rate increased. These are all things that are very hard to measure when it comes to modern day science, but they nonetheless exist. Similarly, when it comes to all of the various forms of worship that Allah has prescribed for us, all of them have benefit for us. Earlier, the Imam was speaking in the khutbah about how it is we who need Islam. It's not Allah who needs us or Islam who needs us. We benefit from it. We benefit spiritually, we benefit physically, we benefit emotionally. About prayer, again, a quick example, there are studies now on the benefits of prayer and meditation, numerous benefits. They're finding that people who pray on a very regular basis have longer lives. They're finding that they have lower blood pressure. They're finding they have lower rates of anxiety and depression. They even found in some studies that they get sick less often, and even when they do, they recover quicker. Again, this is published data that's available. Similarly, when it comes to fasting, that's another whole subject, but as a simple example, fasting is not just for our spiritual benefit, it is a type of cleansing and detoxification for our body. It turns out that when we stay away and refrain from food and drink, it allows our body to focus on whatever issues may be wrong and accelerate rates of healing. Another key aspect of Islam and the recommendations of the Prophet ﷺ relate to a balanced lifestyle. You know, diet itself is such a vast topic. I mean, we could have another whole seminar just on that, but there are so many guidelines from the Prophet ﷺ and from our deen regarding diet. We've all heard of the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says that 1/3 of the stomach should be for our food, 1/3 for drink, and 1/3 should be empty. Really, if we just stop and think about that alone, you know, millions of people could avoid all kinds of disease just from overeating. I think all of you would agree with me. Similarly, there are other hadith, for example, a famous one mentions how the stomach or the digestive system is the root of all diseases. Maybe in the question answer I can elaborate on that more, but if you look at modern day research even on this, you see that that is very true. That many diseases are emerging from poor digestion. Similarly, the Prophet ﷺ gave various recommendations regarding food combinations. You know, the Prophet ﷺ classified, as do most traditional forms of medicine, he classified foods and even medicines according to what we call their ta'thir, which is hot or cold. There are different degrees of heat, different degrees of cold and neutral. And he basically prescribed that a diet should be balanced in terms of the hot aspect and the cold aspect. As a simple example, the Prophet ﷺ talked about melons being cool and how dates, the warmth of dates, balance that out. Similarly, we look at most cultures, you know, most meats, oils are considered very warm or hot. And so you see that when Indians eat biryani, they balance it out with what? Yogurt, exactly. Even when Greeks eat their nice, you know, gyros sandwiches, their lamb, what do they balance it with? Same thing, right? Yogurt. So there's, again, a concept of balance that pertains to diet as well. Same thing when it comes to hygiene and tahara. Islam has a very amazing view of all this. Later in the question answer, if you want, we could talk a little bit about the importance of water also, and how the Quran, for example, talks about وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ, that from water, life has emerged and is key for life itself. There are very interesting research now in the modern world about water and its importance, and we could maybe elaborate on that later, inshallah. Similarly, when it comes to exercise, there may not be that many specific guidelines from the Prophet ﷺ, but we know very well that in his time and in the time of the companions, they engaged in wrestling, horseback riding, archery, swimming, all of these things. And we know very well that in the common everyday lives of the companions, there was so much physical activity, walking, no cars, no rickshaws, none of this. And so the level of physical activity was also very different then. The last point too I mentioned also is that we have a balance in Islam between what we call asceticism, or what in Arabic they call zuhd, and materialism. Asceticism is kind of like people who try to deny the world completely. For example, the monks, where they leave the world altogether and don't engage in marriage. They try to specifically refrain from various types of food for months on end and try to deny their self. Similarly, Islam does not advocate, crass materialism, where we're just consume, and in the process we end up compromising our own health and everything. It has a balance that exists between those two opposites as well. Now, this particular category is what a lot of times common people will associate with the medicine of the Prophet ﷺ. And this relates to various natural foods and medicines and plants. It turns out that the Quran and the Hadith actually mention over 100 specific foods, herbs, or plants, either in the Quran or Hadith. Afterwards, if you want, I have some books that discuss each of these in more detail. But they're used for a lot of different purposes. Herbal medicine and the use of food as medicine is as old as the existence of human beings. And so they're used for almost everything. They're what we call antimicrobial agents. They're what we call purgatives that induce excretion from the body. Diuretics induce urination. There's what we call emetics, which can induce vomit. Diaphoretics induce sweat. And so many different purposes of these various foods and medicine. But an interesting trend in all of the various forms of traditional medicine is that food is medicine. There's no distinguishing between, prescription med and a food. Foods, herbs, plants, these are all medicine. They have benefits, and so it's up to us, and it behooves us to find out what those are. A few examples. Obviously, we don't have time to go into hundreds of different foods and plants here, but the two most commonly mentioned things by common people are black seed and what is another one that you think of? Honey, that's right. We'll talk about those two things and maybe a couple others, but we obviously don't have time to go into detail in this. But I'll give you a few practical tips regarding these two. Black seed, as you know, there's the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that says it is a cure for every disease except death. In modern day research, they found that it's good for lowering blood pressure. It has antibacterial, antiparasitic agents. It's good for allergies. It's good for asthma, good for digestion. It's so many things I've listed here. And there is a lot of research on this, but there needs to be a lot more. It's really sad that we have so many, Muslims in the healthcare field, so many doctors, but we don't have enough research in this particular area, and I wish we did, but there is some. On a practical level, some people often ask how much to take and so forth. Obviously, it depends on the person and whatever states they may have, whatever conditions they may have. But in general, if you take the seed itself and it's ground up or in the seed form and you mix it in with something else, generally a small pinch of it, or even up to sometimes a half teaspoon is what's prescribed. For certain health conditions, we sometimes prescribe what we call black seed oil. And this is a more concentrated form where, as you know, if you have like this much seed, if you extract the oil, you end up with just this much oil from this much seed. The reason I mention that is it's much more potent for certain purposes. Like for example, if you're taking it to help yourself with preventing or lowering your bad cholesterol, elevating your good cholesterol, then it's better to take the oil form. And that too, the dosage can vary, but some people will take anywhere from half to a teaspoon or sometimes more for certain medical conditions. Quality-wise too, unfortunately, you know, with so many products out there, and in the Muslim world we have, unfortunately, people who are out to make a quick buck also. So sometimes, and in India, Pakistan, it happens too, sometimes people contaminate or dilute the oil with other types of oil. So it's good to have some knowledge of the taste of black seed. If you go botanically, it's called Nigella sativa. I've shown a picture here, but you can also look it up online. It has generally a bitter, pungent taste. And generally, if I taste the oil or I taste the seed, I can recognize it. But kind of beware of imitation products in this particular regard. Similarly, when it comes to honey, you know, I've seen articles, this is a huge subject also, but I don't know if you all are aware, but do you all know about the honeybees and how they've been dying in big numbers? Have any of you heard about this? Have any of you heard about why this is happening? What's that?
Pesticide.
Pesticide, yeah, I mean, that's one part of it. They're still trying to narrow down exactly why it's happening, but they've actually had whole congressional hearings on this in Congress just to try to figure out what's going on. A lot of people know, there was a saying from Albert Einstein once that he said that if all the bees die, he said within a few days the human beings and the human race will start to die. If you ask a scientist or somebody who studies agronomy, they'll tell you the importance of honeybees in the overall life cycle of plants and foods. It's not just, honeybees are not just about honey. They're very important for all plants and flowers in general. And they're dying, as you said, in very big numbers, and this is causing certain issues on a practical level. As an example, I think 2 years ago I saw a report on the news that because there's an overall shortage of honey in the world, some of the biggest companies that have to supply honey throughout the world, for example to Walmart and Sam's Club and so forth, because they have a shortage, they started feeding the honeybees a sugar solution. That's not even honey, right? You can make a type of honey and the honeybees can do that, but it's not honey at all. To give you perspective on this, honeybees typically need to pollinate around 2 million flowers